In my previous program, just a few hours ago, I spoke about how there were reports coming from the United States that Israel, the Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government had resolved or had informed the United States that Israel would not be attacking nuclear facilities and would not be attacking oil facilities in Iran, and that when Israel did strike against Iran, it would be focusing principally and mostly against Iranian military sites. I did express some puzzlement about this. I did wonder how a single Israeli strike on Iran, given the resources that Israel possesses, would be able to do significant damage to a military like the Iranian military, which is both very big and very widely dispersed. But anyway, those were the reports. Well, a few hours later, we got other reports, this time from Israel itself, which appear to flatly contradict the story of these assurances. It seems that the Israelis might be prepared to attack oil and energy and even nuclear facilities. After all, no final decision one way or the other has been made. And though the Israelis obviously listen to what the Americans tell them, they don't apparently make their decisions purely on that basis. And in my program yesterday, I said that President Zelensky was due to unveil his so-called victory plan to the Verkhovnaya Rada, the Ukrainian parliament in Kiev, that the victory plan would outline his own rather exceptional, rather extreme demands for the West to supply basically unlimited support to Ukraine. As we will see, that is exactly what the victory plan does. Indeed, it goes further than I had supposed. But I also said that there were lots of reports, lots of rumors circulating in the Western media and to some extent in the Ukrainian media and amongst various people in Ukraine putting up tweets and messages and other things, all of which suggested that behind the scenes, in reality, President Zelensky and his officials were beginning to understand that not only was the war lost, but that the only way out for Ukraine was to accept territorial concessions to the Russians, the occupation by Russia, the continued occupation by Russia of territories in Ukraine's east, and that the Ukrainians were now looking for a conflict freeze. And though that in itself seemed to me completely unrealistic, given the Russian stance, nonetheless, it did suggest a dawning of reality in Kiev. Well, that was yesterday. We've now had Zelensky's speech to the Ukrainian parliament, and as far as I can see, it is as intransigent as ever. It again rules out a freeze of the conflict or any agreement, any concession in terms of occupation by the Russians of Ukraine's eastern territory, or what Ukraine says is Ukraine's eastern territory. And in fact, there is nothing about Zelensky's speech which I can see which suggests any sort of shift of position at all. Anyway, I'm going to return to both of these issues shortly, but I would say that yet again, 24 hours has once again cleared the position, cleared our understanding of where things are. And it's now becoming increasingly clear to me that in the West, in Europe, in Ukraine as well, an awful lot of wishful thinking is taking place. people in the United States and in Europe are hoping that the Israelis will exercise a certain degree of restraint, but the Israelis have never agreed to do that. And people in the United States and in Europe, or at least in some places in Europe, and some people in Ukraine as well, are hoping that President Zelensky and his team are going to show some realism about the military situation, and are hoping and expecting and wishing that he will do so. But again, they are blind to the reality that President Zelensky is not interested in the kind of peace and the sort of concessions that they would like him to make. So anyway, let's understand that. Let's accept that once and for all. Let's also acknowledge the truth that the Israelis are going to continue very much as they have been doing over the last few months and indeed year, and that anyone who expects much in the way of restraint from the Israelis is going to be disappointed, to put it mildly. And let us also accept that the Ukrainians are not prepared to shift from the position that they finally took in the autumn of 2022, which is that nothing less than a total victory over Russia will do, however unachievable or unrealizable all that is. Any speculation, any rumor, any discussion to that effect appearing anywhere in the Western media, floated by Western officials, discussed in tweets and messages and those sort of places, as of today, as of now, it all looks to me to be so much wishful thinking and to be based on no actual substance at all. So all of the discussions that I had yesterday about what might happen with the Israelis, what the steps that the Israelis might make, and about how they might have been deterred by the Iranian missile strike, and all of the discussions yesterday about Ukraine and about what the Ukrainians might do, and about the way in which Ukrainian concessions looked like they were going to be nowhere near enough. All of that is moot because neither the Israelis nor the Ukrainians are prepared to shift at all. Anyway, let's start with Israel. Let's go back to what is happening in Israel. The Israelis have once again been bombing South Beirut. There are comments appearing in the media that the Americans are unhappy, that they feel that the bombing in South Beirut is too heavy, that they want the Israelis to come up with some kind of strategy for victory. What exactly their plan is, that bombing by itself is not enough, all the same things that were said a year ago about a military operation in Gaza. There's even a story floating around in the media this morning that the United States is warning Israel that if it doesn't moderate its stance in Gaza specifically, if it doesn't take action to relieve the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, then the United States might impose a total arms embargo on Israel. Well, I don't think anybody in Jerusalem is going to take that seriously. I don't take that seriously. I'm sure most people don't. I am not expecting any such move by the United States. If the Americans really are saying these things to the Israelis, then it's a bluff, and it's a bluff that the Israelis have called many times now, and as a result, it is a bluff which has no credibility behind it. Maybe the Americans, maybe some people in the Pentagon, maybe top US officials in Washington, in the Pentagon, in the intelligence community, even some in the White House, would like the Israelis to slow down or stop or rethink. But the president himself and the officials closest to him are not prepared to take that step. And as for an arms embargo on Israel, as the administration perfectly well knows, any such move would encounter extremely strong opposition in Congress and would almost certainly fall apart very quickly. And besides, as an electoral strategy in advance of the elections next year, it probably won't fly. So anyway, a bluff which is certain to be called if these rumours are even true. By the way, a couple of weeks ago, I remember reading in the Times of Israel that the United States was so angry with some of Netanyahu's officials, specifically with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the security minister in charge of the police, that's Ben Gvir. Smotrich is the finance minister. You're universally acknowledged to be the most hardline figures in the cabinet, even more hardline than Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. They're people who clearly want to see the temple rebuilt in Jerusalem. They want Israel to take control, full control of the Temple Mount. According to Alistair Crook, they've even brought together the heifers, which are going to be sacrificed once the ceremonies in the temple resume. Anyway, there were reports in the Times of Israel that the United States was actually considering imposing sanctions against these two officials, and that the fact had been communicated to the Israelis. Well, the Israelis paid no attention. Smotrich and Ben Gvir paid no attention. And, of course, the United States failed to impose sanctions on these two officials. So there we are. So let's go to the media reports. Zero Hedge has provided an account, but, of course, the key article is in Bloomberg, and it straightforwardly challenges or disputes the article that I discussed yesterday, the one that had appeared in the Washington Post about Israel having told the United States that it is not going to attack energy and nuclear facilities. And Bloomberg reports Netanyahu's office as saying, "We listen to the opinions of the United States, but we will make our final decisions based on our national interests." And it's then being said that this is widely being taken as a clear denial of the main substance of the Washington Post report, in which it was reported that Netanyahu had told the Americans that Israel would not attack Iran's nuclear or oil sites. And anyway, Bloomberg goes on to say that a report in the Washington Post said that the Israeli premier had agreed to limit his retaliation for an October 1st Iranian ballistic missile salvo to military targets. The newspaper cited two officials familiar with the matter who it didn't identify. Such a decision might not sit well with more hardline Israelis. And then there's a quote from Ben Gvir. "We have an opportunity to cut off the head of the snake," he said, in reference to Iran. And Ben Gvir, unsurprisingly, declined to discuss internal Iranian discussions. I'm going to come back to the point about cutting off the head of the snake in a moment. And then we have also had comments from Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. He has again apparently yesterday reiterated that Israel's response to Iran would be soon, accurate and lethal. This is apparently confirmed by Al Arabiya. And, of course, lastly, we've had more discussion of the deployment by the United States of the THAAD missile launcher in Israel, which I will come to shortly. So what exactly does Ben Gvir mean by cutting off the head of the snake? Well, nuclear sites across Iran, they're supposed to be extremely heavily hardened. No doubt they're very well protected. The Iranians will have been expecting such a strike now for years and will presumably have been preparing for it. Almost certainly, the Iranian nuclear program has massive redundancy built into it. There could, of course, be an attack on the Iranian nuclear power station at Bushehr. If that happens, by the way, it will enrage the Russians, who have largely built it, just saying. But the Bushehr nuclear reactor does not seem to be the main part of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. As far as I can tell, this is being carried out by various centrifuges based on technology Iran presumably obtained from Pakistan. And besides, according to many reports, Iran already has a sufficiently enriched uranium to move forward with a nuclear weapons program, should it make the decision to do so. And apparently, according to the US intelligence community, they have assessed that despite the events of the last couple of weeks, despite the fighting in southern Lebanon, the decapitation strikes against Hezbollah, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the Iranians have still not made that decision. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has apparently for the moment made no decision to move forward with a Iranian nuclear weapons program. I have read what I consider to be fairly definitive and authoritative reports that even if Iran has stockpiled enough enriched uranium to produce a nuclear device, it would take Iran at least a year, probably longer, before it could produce a nuclear weapon, or at least even a notional nuclear weapon. And in order for a nuclear weapon to be produced effectively, successfully, there would have to be a nuclear weapons test, and that would obviously be visible globally. And if there was a nuclear weapons test, it would still take time for Iran to develop a sufficient stockpile of actual nuclear weapons and to miniaturize its nuclear weapons to the point where they could be loaded onto warheads on Iranian missiles. We would be looking at a threat that would probably materialize only some years into the future. Now, I say all of that. I am well aware of the fact that there are reports that seismic signals from Iran have already suggested that some kind of underground nuclear test has actually taken place over the course of the last few weeks. I'm going to say this. I've seen some people, some very authoritative people have written to me who lend some credence to this. I am myself still skeptical about these reports, deeply skeptical about these reports, because if they were true, I am sure that both the Israelis and the Americans would have made the fact public and would have insisted upon this in order to move forward that major attack on Iran that they so obviously want to undertake. So I am, unless I see much more evidence, I'm not for the moment persuaded that any kind of Iranian nuclear test has happened. I appreciate there will be some people who disagree with me, but that, at least for the moment, is my own view. Anyway, let's move on. So, attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, very complex, very difficult. Attacks on Iranian military facilities, unlikely to achieve very much. Attacks on Iranian oil and energy facilities, perhaps rather easier to do. It's unlikely that they're defended to anything like the same extent, but nonetheless, a strong demonstration of resolve by the Israelis, but an action which would upset the administration, but perhaps more specifically would upset the Gulf states, the other Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia and the other states. They would be worried about potential Iranian retaliation against their own sites. And given that Israel, the Netanyahu government, has in the last few years been working to establish diplomatic relations with some of these states, and of course has successfully done so with some of them, and has been working to establish diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. I wonder whether the Israelis would really want to do that to any strong or great degree. Just saying. So that leaves the option of a decapitation strike, an attempt to inflict injury on Iran's leadership by assassinating specific Iranian leaders, perhaps President Pezeshkian, perhaps the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei himself, as various reports in the Israeli media have apparently suggested. And we now come back then to Ben Gvir's comment about Israel wanting to cut off the head of the snake. Well, perhaps that is putting it too strongly, but that does seem to me to point to a plan for some kind of a decapitation strike. Just saying. Of course, it could be that Ben Gvir, whose grip on reality perhaps one should question, perhaps he is one of these people who thinks that any kind of Israeli strike on Iran is going to be massively successful, that Iran is a house of cards, that if a few military facilities or oil installations or nuclear sites are destroyed in an Israeli strike, that will in itself suffice to cause the entire Islamic Republic to come crashing down. Well, maybe that's what he means by the fact that Israel has an opportunity to cut off the head of the snake. But I have to say, taken together with what Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, is saying, and looking at what the Israelis have been doing over the last couple of months with their assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, their attacks on and assassinations of prominent Hezbollah and Hamas leaders, I wonder whether a plan to assassinate Iranian leaders is really more likely to be on the cards. And we come back, of course, to what Gallant said about an attack that would be precise and lethal and powerful and above all surprising. Could it be, this is just again my own guess, I'm just speculating now, could it be that we are completely wrong in thinking that a missile strike is what is being planned? Perhaps it's something altogether different. Perhaps it's a rerun of the Haniyeh assassination, of Israel using whatever assets it has already infiltrated into Iran, people from various dissident Iranian organizations, perhaps Israeli infiltrators. Perhaps the plan is to use these assets to carry out an assassination of one of Iran's top officials. After all, they were able to get through and assassinate Haniyeh. Maybe the Israelis believe that they can do the same with Khamenei or Pezeshkian or the leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or someone else. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. It seems to me that it's full steam ahead. Israel is going to carry out its attack on Iran. It hears and listens to what the Americans are saying, but it's going to make its own decisions, and it has just said as much. And people like Ben Gvir are still pushing the idea of some kind of an attack on Iran. They see the opportunity, as Ben Gvir says, to cut off the head of the snake, and that is apparently what they're going to do. And by the way, Ben Gvir is reported to have said this to Israeli army radio. Can I just say something here, which is that, of course, the Iranians would have to respond to an attack on their leaders in a completely different way to the way that they responded to an attack, the attack on Haniyeh. If someone like Pezeshkian or Khamenei or someone like that is assassinated as a result of Israeli action, well, that would be straightforwardly an act of war. Of course, the Israelis would say that Israel and Iran are already in effect at war. But this would be an act of war very different from any of the other actions that the Israelis or the Iranians have carried out against each other. It would be moving away from the undercover war that the two sides have been fighting against each other in the Middle East for, well, about 2 decades now. It will be an open attack on Iran at the very highest level. And if it doesn't produce the effect which Ben Gvir expects, if the snake still survives, if it turns out that the whole metaphor of a snake is wrong and killing an Iranian leader, far from cutting off the head of the snake, simply means that he is going to be replaced by another leader equally determined and equally resolute. If that is the case, then Israel could very well find that it has achieved nothing, just as the assassination of Nasrallah doesn't ultimately seem to have achieved anything. There is Hezbollah is still there. It continues to fight. That is why Israel has to continue bombing southern Lebanon and why its troops are continuing to fight in southern Lebanon. If Iran, the Islamic Republic, remains solid and intact, then it will respond to such an assassination. and almost certainly it will respond by missile strikes against Israel. Missile strikes on a more massive scale than the ones we have seen, more massive than the missile strike that took place on the 1st of October, about which we are now being told by the Financial Times and the Daily Telegraph that dozens of Iranian missiles got through and were successful in striking the big Nevatim air base in the Negev desert. So there we go. So that is, we're being set up again. It looks to me again that we're being set up for an escalation of the conflict in the Middle East. The Israelis putting all caution to the winds, refusing to pay much attention to what the Americans are saying. The Americans spinning perhaps more emollient words by Netanyahu and his officials to imply that Netanyahu and his officials are moderating their course when clearly they're not. And as I said, we're moving steadily towards that war in the Middle East that the Iranians are clearly now preparing for. Now, let's return briefly to the topic of the THAAD missiles, because I've received a mass of emails about this, including from all sorts of very well-informed people. I noticed that Larry Johnson on Sonar 21 has also discussed the THAAD missile complex. Well, there are different opinions about the THAAD's sophistication and capabilities. Everyone, however, acknowledges a number of things about it. Firstly, that it is not completely 100% foolproof. It isn't guaranteed to shoot down all the ballistic missiles or any one specific ballistic missile. Some missiles can penetrate it. As I said, it is not guaranteed to be successful. And everyone also agrees that the system lacks resilience, that there just aren't enough of these interceptor missiles to go around. That, of course, is what the Financial Times said yesterday, and that will be a problem if the Iranians are able to sustain a major missile offensive against against Israel, backed, of course, by the Houthis and by Hezbollah. Of course, I accept that saying that begs the question whether the Iranians do have that capability, whether their resources, whether their missile arsenal is indeed as big and as powerful as many think. But when preparing for war, one should at least take into account the possibility that the other side is indeed as strong as most reports suggest. And given that the only information we have about the Iranians and about Hezbollah and about the Houthis is that they do indeed possess extensive and very powerful missile arsenals, and given that it is an acknowledged and known fact that supplies of air defense missile interceptors in the West, not just in Israel, are finite and relatively few, I would have thought that trundling forward into a confrontation with Iran, one which might very well fail to cut off the head of the snake, is an astonishing and dangerous gamble, one which, if it fails to come off, could lead to all sorts of extraordinary and very dangerous consequences. Just saying. One of the fundamental facts about neocon thinking in the United States, and it is reflected in thinking in Israel itself, is that, as I have discussed numerous times, the neocons never look at capabilities. They always assume them. They always assume that American capabilities will suffice for any conceivable military scenario. So they didn't look at what the capabilities of Russia might be in the conflict in Ukraine. They didn't look at the potential capabilities of the United States in supplying weapon systems to Ukraine. They made the same mistakes in all of the various conflicts that have been fought out in the Middle East since the events of 9/11. They have, and I wonder whether they're making the same mistake all over again, and whether their allies, their friends in Israel, are perhaps making the same mistake also. They're gambling that the Iranian regime is fragile and brittle and will collapse the moment it is struck. And I wonder whether they have a realistic plan if that assumption proves to be wrong, whether they in fact have a plan B if plan A fails. I can very easily see how, if there is a missile war between Iran and Israel, and Israel starts to run out of missiles, and the United States is unable to replace those missiles because its own stockpiles are declining, the pressure will increase for a further massive escalation against Iran. And well, if that happens, which would involve, it could only involve the United States being involved directly itself, if this is going to be an escalation confined to conventional weapons, well, then the United States could find itself pulled into a war in the Middle East against what might prove to be a powerful adversary, supported by the BRIC states, itself, of course, a BRIC state with no easy pathway to victory. And of course, that isn't even taking into account even more disturbing possibilities that the Israelis might be driven to use some of the very powerful weapons, we all know what I'm referring to, that Israel is universally acknowledged to possess, which it might, of course, do if it feels that far from the snake being killed, it is coming after Israel, which is short of weapons of its own. The Israelis feel that their situation has become so bad that it has become existentially bad. I, for one, have no doubt that they will go all of the way in order to try to preserve themselves. Just saying. Well, if that, of course, happens, then it won't just be the Middle East. It will be the whole world that will have changed. And I don't want to think about the consequences of that and discuss those consequences, what they might be in this kind of program. So anyway, there we are. A massive gamble is about to play itself out. It's a gamble which I think will be lost, like all other neocon gambles of the last couple of years have been lost. And, well, the consequences of failure or of complete failure are terrifying, and one only hopes that whoever the next president in the United States is, that person will have the force of personality and the strength of will and the sense of urgency that such a situation calls for to call a stop. Anyway, that's the situation in the Middle East as of now. No sign, as I said, of any drawback from the Israelis. On the contrary, all the evidence is that they're pushing forward and that they have allies in the United States who want to push them forward, want them to push forward as well. What about the Ukrainians? Well, we've now had Zelensky's speech to the Ukrainian parliament, and he made absolutely clear what his position about a freeze is. These are his words. Now, I'm taking this as a quotation from the official Russian news agency TASS. They've translated his words into English. Of course, it could be that they're misrepresenting him, but I think that is extremely unlikely. Anyway, this is what he said. There will be no, according to TASS, and I'm sure this is true, there will be no freezing of the conflict. There will be no trading of territory or Ukrainian sovereignty. We must implement this plan. And by that he means the victory plan. So the victory plan is his plan A. There is no plan B. He has no plan B. He's going to press on until victory. If the Western powers won't accept his victory plan, well, even then it seems he's not interested in negotiating any kind of end to the war. There will be no freezing of the conflict. There will be no trading of territory or Ukrainian sovereignty. Any prospect of negotiations, it seems to me, has been conclusively shut down. Given that Zelensky has said these things to the Ukrainian parliament, to the Rada, I think it would be unbelievably difficult, politically impossibly difficult for him to row back on these words. Incidentally, yesterday, one of his senior aides, Mikhailo Podolyak, also gave an interview in which he also appeared to rule out a freezing of the conflict or of negotiations or of territorial concessions, even the watered-down territorial concessions that one would expect from a freeze that many have been talking about. Now, what about the victory plan itself? I said at the start of the program that it is very much what we have been led to believe, only it seems to go even further. Now, here I'm a little constrained because I haven't myself got the full text yet, as of the time of making of this program, of Zelensky's words. But to the extent that I've been able to piece it all together, it seems that Zelensky's plan is for Ukraine to join NATO pretty much immediately, for the United States and NATO to help Ukraine increase its own weapons production. This is absolutely absurd idea, by the way, given that the Russians are attacking continuously industrial and military facilities all over Ukraine. But anyway, that's what he proposes. He talks about deploying on the territory what he apparently refers to as a non-nuclear deterrent complex. And it's been suggested that what he means by that is that the Western powers should deploy air defense complexes, perhaps other types of missiles, on the territory of Ukraine itself. That, in effect, if that is true, what he's basically talking there is for Western boots on the ground. It might be that he means something going beyond that as well. This is, in other words, a straightforward demand for boots, Western boots on the ground in Ukraine, that which, of course, the Western powers have consistently rejected. He also talks about allowing deep strikes inside Russia. Well, we all knew about that, the missile strikes inside Russia. That must go ahead, according to him. And he wants further limits on oil and gas prices, Russian oil and gas prices, to be imposed by the Western powers around the world. Apparently, the failure of the G7 price cap on Russian oil was not dramatic enough. Zelensky wants that plan, that ill-starred plan of the price cap, to be not only continued with, but to be taken still further. To be taken further still, presumably pushing Russia towards some kind of economic collapse, or at least that appears to be what Zelensky himself is proposing. Anyway, there it is. That's Zelensky's victory plan, to the extent that I've been able to work it out. Note that if this is the entire plan, it is not a battle plan. He's not discussing, he's not setting out here any approach that the Ukrainian military or the Western military could follow to try to defeat the Russian military in Ukraine. There's no war plan of that kind. What this amounts to instead, is a plan for Ukraine to join NATO, to be integrated immediately into the NATO and Western alliance system, for the Western powers, in effect, to take over the defense of Ukraine. And, well, the Ukrainians have made some moves to this effect. They've recently passed a law which is clearly envisaged to allow Western NATO officers and military personnel to enter Ukraine and to fight in Ukraine wearing Ukrainian uniforms. That's essentially what it seems to me that it amounts to. Of course, an awful lot of that has been going on already. We know, for example, that there's been large numbers of Polish troops, volunteers if you prefer, fighting in Ukraine, commanded by Polish officers, and they've been apparently fighting and functioning as Ukrainian soldiers, but the Russians, of course, know who they are. Anyway, that's already been happening, but it's now been legalized, and presumably Zelensky wants it extended. And in return for all these boots on the ground from the West, he's apparently thrown in a proposal that if all of this happens, once Ukraine has won its great victory over the Russians, then the Americans, the entire American military, can leave Europe and go home, because the strong, incredibly strong Ukrainian military can take its place, and the Americans won't be needed in Europe anymore. Well, I cannot believe that anyone in the Pentagon, in Europe, takes this plan seriously. It is a plan for an unlimited escalation of the war, and as a result, it is dead on arrival. When it was presented to the Americans by Zelensky a few weeks ago in Washington, apparently the Americans gave it a cold reception, and one gets the sense that it's being given the same cold reception pretty much everywhere. Even the NATO Secretariat doesn't seem to be that keen. A couple of programs ago, I said that the sole begetter, the originator of the conflict freeze idea in its present form appears to be Jens Stoltenberg. If you recall, about a year ago, after the failure of Ukraine's summer offensive, a close aide of Jens Stoltenberg, I seem to remember he was Jens Stoltenberg's own chief of staff, actually gave an interview in which he floated the idea of a conflict freeze in which the Russians remained in continued occupation or control of various territories in eastern Ukraine, which they were occupying, but a conflict freeze which would open the way for Ukraine to join NATO. And at that time, this is before the fall of Avdiivka, there was a huge uproar about this, both in Ukraine itself and amongst various people in the West, and the plan was dropped. But recently, after his retirement, in interviews with the Financial Times, Stoltenberg has basically refloated this idea, and to the best extent that I can see, this idea is also being pushed by various other NATO officials. It's their idea of the way forward. They understand that a direct conflict between the West and Russia would be both impossible and unacceptable to the Western public, as well as being incredibly dangerous. And they've been trying to get the Ukrainians, Zelensky, and his officials to accept it. The Americans also seem to be looking at this NATO idea. It's their way out of this impossible situation in Ukraine. But Zelensky, it looks as if, is having none of it. He's coming up instead with his alternative plan, which can perhaps be best described as a plan for World War III. Immediate NATO entry for Ukraine, immediate integration of Ukraine into NATO's entire military system, an ultimatum in effect to the Russians to capitulate, and if that doesn't happen, NATO in effect to go to war with Russia on behalf of Ukraine. And that is all the only plan that Zelensky says he has. If it's not accepted, if it's not adopted, his officials have already said that in that case, Ukraine will go on fighting in much the way that it has been doing up to now. It will just go on fighting until eventually, presumably, it is defeated and collapses, by which time, presumably, Zelensky and his officials, Yermak, Podolyak, and the others, will have packed their bags and will have gone. Well, as I said, I cannot imagine that the West will accept this plan. As I said, it is not a plan that even the NATO Secretariat, who are promoting the settlement freeze idea, the freeze idea, that even they are prepared to adopt. And as I said, it is impossible to see how it can be made to work. And I'm sure that it cannot be made to work. And the Pentagon will almost certainly rule it out. And as it happens, just yesterday, I understand the Pentagon spokesman again repeated that, in fact, said quite explicitly that the United States has only finite resources, that the Secretary, meaning Lloyd Austin, is concerned to husband America's strength, that the United States, the Pentagon, will give to Ukraine what it can, but that the level of support it can provide to Ukraine is by definition finite. Now, I said that there is no prospect of this plan being adopted, but that doesn't mean, unfortunately, that possibilities for further escalation are not going to be considered. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, is, as I said, shortly due to visit Berlin, where he's going to have meetings with Chancellor Scholz. It was suggested that there would be no time to have a proper Rammstein meeting. But the very latest report from CNN suggests that other European leaders, Macron, Starmer, perhaps Meloni, perhaps Sanchez, are being invited to attend. There's no word whether Zelensky himself will be invited to attend. So clearly, they're all going to meet and they're going to discuss the situation in Ukraine. And, well, one possibility is that all of these leaders will come together and they will agree that the war is in effect lost, and they will do what they can to try to force Zelensky to see sense and to see reason, and perhaps they will try to force him to accept the freeze idea, even though the Russians, of course, have already conclusively rejected it. But for the Western powers, diplomatically speaking, that seems to be the only game in town. That is one possibility, and it's not to be excluded. It could be that that is what the Americans are now thinking about, that they want the Europeans to pile on the pressure on the Ukrainians to get the Ukrainians to see sense. But I suspect that the truth is otherwise. I suspect that what President Biden is now concerned about is that he doesn't want a collapse in Ukraine whilst he is still president. In other words, he wants to avoid the collapse in Ukraine between now and the date of his leaving office at the end of January. He wants whatever blame is going to fall for the eventual collapse of Ukraine to be blame placed upon his successor, whoever that successor is. And of course, if the successor is the Republican challenger, well, so much the better. So, what I suspect President Biden is going to do is he's going to try to strong-arm all of the various European leaders to increase their support for Ukraine in the last months before the end of his presidency. He's going to want them to move forward with a 35 billion euro loan, $40 billion loan. He's going to want them to step up arms supplies to Ukraine to the extent that they can. He's going to pressure them to increase sanctions pressure on the Russians. He's going to try to get them to agree to all of that. And based on everything we know about what has happened in this conflict since its inception, ever since basically Angela Merkel ceased to be Chancellor of Germany in the summer of 2021, the European leaders will back down and will agree to whatever Biden asks. So, we are likely to see a last big final burst of Western aid to Ukraine before the end. It will not come close to matching Zelensky's victory plan. As I said, I think that no one in the West wants to go there. It will not be enough to change the trajectory of the war. Brian Beletic has published a whole succession of videos pointing out how to all intents and purposes this is now impossible, and he is right. There is a real risk, a genuine possibility that Biden might go round the Pentagon and finally agree to the deep missile strikes against Russia. He might try to strong-arm Scholz to agree to that. In Germany, the main opposition leader, Friedrich Merz, the leader of the CDU, has taken the extremely unpopular stance of also apparently wanting to authorize supplies of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. This is all opinion polls show that German public opinion opposes this move, but Merz says that he supports it, and he also says that if the Russians continue their bombing and missile offensive on Ukraine, he would be up for allowing the Ukrainians to use these Taurus missiles to strike at Russia, and then he's going to call the Russians bluff and leave it to the Russians to decide how they intend to escalate. An incredibly reckless move by Friedrich Merz. And again, I wonder whether he's really thought it through and whether he has any plan if it turns out that the Russians aren't bluffing in the way that he appears to think, and if this invites retaliation by the Russians against Germany itself. Just saying. But anyway, that's what he said. And I wonder whether Merz might be saying this because he believes, or has been led to believe, that when Biden comes to Berlin, he's going to try and get Scholz to agree to supply the Taurus missiles to Ukraine and to send all the German technicians with the Taurus missiles and to have them conduct their deep strikes against Russia and perhaps the strikes against the Kerch Bridge and all of that. And it could be that Merz is doing what Atlanticist German politicians regularly do, which is suck up to the Americans. Though, if this is Merz's thinking, then I think he is underestimating the strength of opposition to all of these moves on the part of the German public in advance of the Bundestag elections next year. Just saying. But anyway, chances are that, as I said, we're going to get one last burst of escalation from the Western powers, trying to keep Ukraine fighting on until the current presidency ends, hoping that the president can leave office with Ukraine still there. And of course, what happens after is no longer then the president's concern. Après moi, le déluge, as Louis XV is supposed to have said. After me, the flood. What do I care? I'm no longer there anymore. Anyway, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that instead it's going to be what I said previously, that Biden and the other European leaders are going to try instead to get the Ukrainians to see sense and to negotiate. But as I said, on past behavior, I think that is most unlikely. In the meantime, the war in Ukraine goes on, and things for Ukraine go from bad to worse. Now, let me just say briefly that we're still getting a lot of people in Ukraine especially, but elsewhere too, talking about the North Koreans coming to fight the Russians. I mentioned I spoke yesterday about the Buryat Brigade. There are, as I said already, there are actual volunteer units made up of fighters, Buryat fighters, fighting in with the Russian army in Ukraine. As I said, one unit of Buryat fighters played a significant role in the recent capture of Ugledar. But I apparently misunderstood things. I assumed when I discussed this idea yesterday that talk about the Russian military forming another brigade of Buryat fighters was intended to mean Buryat soldiers commanded by North Korean officers. It seems this isn't true. It seems that what the Ukrainians are telling everybody is that this is going to be an entire North Korean brigade made up of North Korean officers and North Korean soldiers, but that the Russians are going to try and pass it off as a brigade made up of Buryat volunteer fighters. I mean, this is so preposterous. It is so completely ridiculous that I don't really want to waste time about it. The idea that you can have North Korean soldiers and pretend that they're Buryats, two completely different nationalities. I mean, it's just ludicrous. The idea that if this were to happen, no one would know that they were North Korean soldiers, is, as I said, is absurd. And I wonder whether, again, all of these stories about Iranian missile deliveries to Russia, as I said, I speculated yesterday that they might have an Israeli source, those stories, and I suspect that is still true. But I wonder whether all of these stories about Iranian missiles being supplied to Russia, North Korean troops fighting alongside the Russians, all of this nonsense isn't being either instigated by the Ukrainians or at least further publicized by the Ukrainians as part of their efforts to try to get the Western powers involved in the war. Let me repeat again. I've seen no actual evidence that North Korean shells or North Korean missiles or Iranian missiles, let alone North Korean soldiers, are fighting anywhere or being used anywhere on the combat lines. I think it is likely that the Russians are tapping North Korea for shells. Probably North Korean shell factories have to some extent been reactivated to help the Russians do that. But all other rumors and speculations about weapons deliveries from North Korea and Iran, let alone from China, I think can be discounted. Anyway, that, to repeat again, is my view. So there we go. So let's turn to the topic of what is actually going on the battlefronts. And for the Ukrainians, it is getting from bad to worse. There's been more reports from Kursk, the Kursk area. It looks as if the Kursk pocket is continuing to shrink. There have been further reports of more Russian advances on the western end of the pocket. There are some reports that Lyubimovka, the village of Lyubimovka, has now fallen completely under Russian control, that the Russians are now in full control of Tolstoy Lug, that these 2 battalions of Ukrainian troops that were cut off in the Kursk pocket continue to be cut off, that the situation for the Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region continues to get worse. There are further reports that the group of forces north, having recaptured the aggregate plant in Volchansk, has resumed its advances. In Volchansk itself, it's resumed its advance in the area of the high-rise building area, the so-called citadel of Volchansk, which has been bombed almost to complete destruction. There are dramatic reports now coming from the Kupiansk area. Now, this is a particularly difficult area for me to understand because it looks as if the Russians have been conducting over the last few months a very, very complex operation around Kupiansk itself, preparatory to the storming of the city, of the town of Kupiansk. But suffice to say that it looks as if the Russians, having captured Sinkovka village to the east, northeast of Kupiansk, have now entered and are in the process of capturing the village of Petropavlivka, which is located immediately to the south of Sinkovka and to the west of Kupiansk itself. There are also reports that the Russians are now planning north of Kupiansk to cross the Oskol River and to storm certain villages north of Kupiansk, including an important village called Doroshivka. The plan apparently is to try to encircle Kupiansk from the north and to cut off the supplies to Kupiansk from Kharkiv and ultimately, by the way, from the area near Volchansk further to the north. All of this very complicated fighting, which, as I said, I don't pretend fully to understand. But further south on the Oskol River, it seems that the Russians have either captured or are in the process of capturing the two villages of Kolesnikivka and Kruglyakivka, which are located directly on the banks of the Oskol River. So it's starting to look a little bit like the battle for Chasiv Yar. In Chasiv Yar, there was the barrier of the Seversky Donets aqueduct, which is actually certainly not a canal, it's a pipeline, it's a large, wide pipeline. But the Russians have fought to clear the territory first to the east of this pipeline, north and south of Chasiv Yar, and now they've crossed the pipeline north and south of Chasiv Yar. And the result is, as we will see in a moment, that they're now in the process of encircling Chasiv Yar, both from the north and from the south. And it is starting to look as if the Russians are planning to do something similar with Kupiansk. They're gaining control of the villages immediately to the west of Kupiansk, Sinkovka, Petropavlivka, and all of those. They're now located on the banks of the Oskol River, south of Kupiansk itself, at least creating the possibility of a crossing of the Oskol River into the areas to the west and south of Kupiansk itself, threatening Kupiansk's supply lines from the west. And they could be planning to do the same thing if they cross the Oskol River to the north. Now, there are, it seems to me, some difficulties with this plan, if this is really the Russian plan, which is that, of course, the Oskol River is hardly a huge river. It's not the Dnieper, but it is in places a sort of wider river than, it's more than, let's put it like this, it's much more than a stream in these northern places, especially in the autumn, once the rains come. It's not the sort of place you could ford across. You would need to build pontoon bridges, certainly this far north. And of course, the Ukrainians still have large numbers of drones and some artillery, and they would be expected to attack the pontoon bridges. And it might be a rather more complicated operation than it appears. Maybe the ultimate Russian plan is to capture all these places and then to begin their encirclement operation of Kupiansk after the autumn rains have passed, when the rivers start to freeze. In this area, they're likely to freeze quite well. They're further north than in the Dnieper, and the Oskol River, as I said, is a small enough river to be able to freeze. So the Russians could perhaps build their pontoon bridges then, and that might be the moment later in the winter when they do decide to conduct their operation west of the Oskol River. Or perhaps they're planning immediately now something less ambitious, to capture Petropavlivka and to attack eastern Kupiansk, the industrial area of eastern Kupiansk, which lies on the east bank of the Oskol River. But anyway, whatever the Russian plan is, and again I'm exposing once more my lack of knowledge of my lack of expertise in this area, I ought to say that the Russians famously are particularly good bridge builders. They've rehearsed how to do river crossings in many wars, just to say. Anyway, whatever the Russian plans are, the Ukrainians have now taken the decision to order a complete evacuation of the entire civilian population of Kupiansk. So it looks as if the Ukrainians now expect the Battle of Kupiansk to begin in earnest at some point within the next few days or weeks. More probably weeks rather than days. I still get the sense that the earliest that this can really realistically begin is after the autumn rains later this year. In other words, that the Battle of Kupiansk is still some weeks away. But it does look as if we're looking at a major, dramatic deterioration in the position of the Ukrainian forces along the Oskol and Zherebets river lines in the southern Kharkiv area, not far from the city of Slavyansk in northern Donbass, Slavyansk being, of course, the northern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, the last major conurbation still under Ukrainian control in Donbass. So, as I said, a dramatic events taking place there. As I said, this is not a battle that I fully understand. Now, there are reports that the situation around Siversk has been somewhat clarified. There are claims that there's pictures apparently of drone attacks by the Russians in the area around Siversk, most notably in the village of Verkhokamyanska, and this has been taken by some people to believe that the earlier reports, the earlier claim by the Russian Defense Ministry was wrong, that Verkhokamyanska is still under Ukrainian control, and that picture, that film that was briefly published of a Russian flag flying at the western end of Verkhokamyanska was a fake. Now, that might be true. I mean, I don't know. I wonder whether what might have happened is something like this. They're not far from Verkhokamyanska, a little to the east of Verkhokamyanska, there is another village called Verkhokamyanka. Almost identical name, as one so often finds in this area. And I remember when I first heard the report that Verkhokamyanska had fallen under Russian control, whether somebody in the Russian Defense Ministry was confusing the two villages. Verkhokamyanka is unequivocally under Russian control and has been so for some time. And I wonder whether there was a mistake and then whether somebody then rushed to plant a flag using a drone maybe in the western part of Verkhokamyanska to lend some credence to this Russian Defense Ministry report, but that the whole thing was wrong. And it could be that that is what happened. That sort of thing does happen in war. Or it may be that indeed the Russian Defense Ministry was misled by somebody on the battlefield, in which case I would expect that there will be severe consequences for that person, whoever he was. Or it could be that there are Russian troops in Verkhokamyanska, and that these drone attacks on Ukrainian positions there are simply mopping up operations. Just saying. Whatever is going on there, I still believe that the other Russian reports of advances in the Grigorovka and Serebyanka areas north of Siversk are almost certainly true. And I also believe that the Russians are indeed in control of the village of Vimka to the south of Siversk. And Verkhokamyanska itself, I would have thought, likely to fall very soon. Anyway, this is not a key area of the battlefronts for the moment, as I have said. And with the collapse of Ukrainian positions along the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, and with places like Bakhmut under Russian control, it seems to me that the position of the Ukrainian troops in Siversk is becoming more precarious anyway by the day. But further south, in Chasiv Yar, lots of information has now come to light. The Russians have indeed pushed very far from the Seversky Donetsk aqueduct. They have occupied positions apparently in southern Chasiv Yar. They've been continuing to advance incrementally through the central areas of Chasiv Yar. They've captured significant areas to the north of Chasiv Yar. And further south, in Toretsk, we're getting more reports of more Russian advances, and the Russians are now conducting drone attacks on the northwestern outskirts of Toretsk, suggesting that that is where the remaining Ukrainian troops are, all of which further confirms that Toretsk itself is about to fall. So, Toretsk is going to fall soon, Chasiv Yar perhaps a few weeks more. When all of that happens, with the Russians likely to be pushing towards Kupiansk fairly soon, closing the positions around the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, Siversk will be effectively surrounded on multiple sides by powerful forces of the Russians. I cannot imagine that the Ukrainians will be able to hold out there for very much longer, regardless of what is going on in Verkhokamyanska and the villages immediately around this place. Further west, the battles in the Kurakhovo, Selidovo, Pokrovsk area continue. Ukrainian reports about these battles continue to be very bleak. Ukrainian losses in this area continue to be very bleak. Most of the latest reports are coming from Selidovo, where the Russians have now either advanced from the slag heap to the northeast of Selidovo, once again into northeastern Selidovo, or perhaps are close to capturing the slag heap, if you believe, as many do, that the slag heap is still under Ukrainian control. And of course, the Russians have been pushing west from Tsukurinye, further to the south along the railway lines, and closer towards the main roads leading to Selidovo from the west. And the Russians are bombing and launching missile strikes, drone strikes right across Selidovo. And there are already reports circulating that Selidovo is now in operational encirclement, that the Ukrainian troops who are in Selidovo are in effect are effectively encircled now. They can probably still retreat, but they would probably have to leave whatever heavy equipment they have behind them, and they would be target of heavy drone attack by the Russians if they did try and retreat, and the losses would again be extremely high. And further south still, the Ukrainians have apparently now finally acknowledged that the Russians do indeed control Ostrivske, this village to the north of Kurahovo. And there are, by the way, reports that the Russians are now starting to shell one of the 4 villages where the Ukrainian troops are supposed to be encircled, the village of Vovchenka, just north of Ostrivske. And the fighting for this village, in effect, therefore, has already begun. And elsewhere, apparently there's more Russian advances north of Ugledar in the village of Katerinovka. Some reports that Katerinovka has been captured by the Russians. I'm not sure whether that is true. The Russians apparently now clearing the fortified positions south of the village of Bogoyavlenka and preparing to storm that village. And in Zaporozhye and southern Donetsk region, the Russians also gradually creeping towards the last remaining fortified village east of the Dnieper, Velika Novosilka, with apparently plans being prepared for the ultimate capture of that village, prior, perhaps, to an advance along the Dnieper towards Zaporozhye city. So even as Zelensky talks about fighting on, the situation is deteriorating, and he's ruling out negotiations and gambling on the West accepting his victory plan, even though that gamble is certain to be lost, and he too seems to have no real plan B. There is an awful lot of gambling going on. The Israelis are conducting it with Iran. The Ukrainians are conducting it in their own ongoing war. The Russians, by the way, have warned the Israelis that they're taking incredible risks. The Russian ambassador to Israel, Anatoly Viktorov, has told Rossiya 24 television station, "We expect that the commander of the Israeli Defense Forces fully realizes how dangerous risks to the life and health of Russian troops in Khmeimim," that's the Russian base, are. "We use relevant channels to convey our deep concern about the ill-considered and insufficiently thought-out actions of the Israeli forces. I know that both the Israeli military and the country's political leadership are fully aware of our concerns. The Israelis taking incredible risks, risking war with Iran, a war with Iran in which victory, it seems to me, is far from guaranteed, risking confrontation with the Russians over the Russian base in Syria, and of course Zelensky risking the whole of Ukraine because he refuses to negotiate, demands total victory, even as everyone knows that that is unachievable. And the West, incapable of bringing him to his senses. Far too much gambling going on with people's lives and with the future of nations. But there we are. This is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day. More from me soon.